We are really happy to have Matt by here tonight at Politics in Prose. He will be speaking about his new book, All the Truth Is Out, The Week Politics Went Tabloid. And needless to say, this is a very timely subject given that the midterm elections are right around the corner. And then, of course, since we are Politics and Prose, we're always delighted to have authors whose books include both. So very, very, very appropriate for us. And I just want to start with a confession, which is that I was telling this to Matt earlier. So I first heard about this book, and I thought, really? Do we have to revisit Gary Hart and Donna Rice and monkey business? Haven't we already been subjected to enough of that if we're of a certain age and we've lived here long enough in excruciating detail, and don't we already know everything? And I suspect that many others have had that same reaction. And what I've discovered, I just finished the book this afternoon, is that not only has he done a monumental job of reporting and writing about this event in our nation's political life, he's really done it with a very fresh perspective, a tremendous amount of humanity, and a deep kind of understanding of the context of politics. So Brad and I were just saying earlier, it's one of those books where you either think you know it all already or you just don't care. And actually, the truth is, once you've read it, you realize you don't really know it already, and you really should care. So it's just a tremendous, tremendous book. And here's my second confession. My second confession is that, and Matt, this is a hazard of being a local writer in Washington, is that we typically might know some of your friends and colleagues. And so then we can start digging around about things about you, which I have done in the last day or two. I'm sorry, did somebody? Oh, I didn't hear what you said anyway. So whatever. So I asked a couple friends, and everybody was very nice and very polite and said, "There's nothing bad to say about Matt Bai. He's just an amazing guy." But I did find out something. Yeah, I probably had the wrong numbers, but probably not. But what did come out that I think was most telling was this, and that was from a mutual friend of ours who happened to be at a party recently in which there was a celebration of Matt's book. And at this dinner were various key former Hart campaign aides, as well as one of Gary Hart's children. And what my friend said was that they were all extremely complimentary about the book for its honesty and its integrity, but also just because he was willing to take on in this book the really important question about how and whether journalists debate whether sexual indiscretions, other kinds of personal issues are important to understanding a candidate or a politician's character. And this friend of mine said, Matt hasn't written a wet kiss to Hart, but a book that captures one of the most important issues in our media and politics debate today. And I think that was a tremendous way of summing it up. Just a word about Matt for those of you who don't know him, and you'll understand why he was so well suited to write this book, which is his second book about politics. He's a tremendous political journalist. He cut his teeth at the Boston Globe, Newsweek, and the New York Times Magazine. He's now at Yahoo News as the national political columnist. And I think he must, through all of this, learn something about the drama of politics, because he's also writing a screenplay and has even acquired credentials as an actor. He has played himself on an episode of House of Cards. Now, that's pretty cool. So, and beyond all of that, I personally forgive you for being a diehard Yankees fan. So thank you, and welcome to Politics in Prose.
Can I steal this one off here? Before I talk, I forgot to pull a page up that I wanted, so I'm going to stall. Okay, good idea. I'm going to stall for 1 second while I find the page that I'm going to want to find later. There we go. Thank you all for coming. First of all, let me say it's fantastic to be back in the neighborhood where we used to live. My wife, Ellen, is here. And we had our first of two children just a few blocks away. This was our neighborhood store. I've been around the country enough to also appreciate that it's one of the best, if not the best, independent bookstores in the country, and a real source of pride. So thank you. And thank you, Alyssa and Brad, for taking it on. And it looks fabulous, and you've just done a great job. I love that display. I took a picture of your display of my book up there because it's so cool. I'm going to tweet it out. And I want to thank you for coming out on a weeknight. I don't know. I don't know what our kids have done to us, because I feel a little bad, because I've been traveling around the country. Last week I was on the West Coast. I was in San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, and then come back here, and I realized that there are all these people who come out still on like a weeknight to talk about and think about books and issues, and I'm like home playing Candy Crush. So I appreciate. It's overwhelming, actually, and I can't tell you what it means for a writer to be able to. You work so hard on it to be able to talk about it and present it. So I did write this crazy book about Gary Hart and the events of 1987, which people found illogical. And so the first question I often get is why. And so I'll start there, and I will tell you why, which is this is a story. Hi, guys. Friends of mine. This is which most of you are not, just to be clear. I just want to be... this started for me, it's a journey, really, and it started for me in 2000, the end of 2002. I was a very new writer at the New York Times Magazine, and I came upon an item in the newspaper, our newspaper, about Gary Hart thinking about running for president again. He had chaired this National Security Commission, which some of you may be familiar with. It was a big deal, and he'd gotten a little bit of limelight. And I remembered him from college. I'd been in college when he was like the biggest thing, and then he just suddenly imploded, and I was reading Newsweek, in my dorm room, and I thought, I couldn't understand why a guy who'd gone through something like that would ever even think about revisiting it and reemerging. One of the great things about being a magazine writer, and, it's one of the things I miss, actually. I'm only a year out of the magazine, but it's one of the great things is you get to pick up the phone and call Gary Hart and say, can I come see you? And he said, sure. I got on a plane and went out. And I'd never met him before. He was an instantly compelling figure. Brilliant, still, very funny, and absolutely prescient about events, but also, I believed, had no business running for president, really wasn't considering running for president again. What he really wanted was to be heard, reclaimed. He wanted to be now taken seriously and to have transcended this scandal that followed him in a way that it followed almost very few American politicians so persistently over the years. And I wrote a piece about him, and he hated it, and he probably should have, and I went away. But there was something about Hart that stuck with me. That was almost became a kind of obsession for me, to the point where no one wanted to hear me talk about it anymore. And part of it is that as a writer, I hate the feeling that something's been left unexplored, that there's a layer to be excavated that you didn't get to. And I very much had that feeling about this story. There was something about it. And then also I went on to cover 2 more presidential campaigns, and I saw how the process was changing, how the relationship with candidates was changing. And you sit across from these candidates for long interviews, as I did with the New York Times Magazine, and you see them looking at you like you are a hired assassin. And you see the look in their eyes of, why am I get that you want to kill me, but why am I made to sit down in point-blank range and have this conversation with you? And I saw how increasingly rare it was for candidates to speak with any kind of nuance or complexity, to offer anything that could resemble really an idea or something to be argued with. And I thought there was a connection, and I started to go back. And when you go back, what you realize, as Lissa mentioned, is that you go back and you realize that a lot of things you thought about this that are kind of received wisdom are just not true. It's a given when you start to talk about this. And when I first started to talk about it and didn't know very much, people were very adamant that I was mistaken. At first, people know that Gary Hart stood up and challenged the world to follow him around. He said, follow me around, put a tail on me, you'll be bored. And they did. And because of him and his challenge, not only did he unravel, but all the standards of politics, privacy, and political lives changed. Well, it's just not true. He actually did say that to one reporter, E.J. Dionne, who we know well here in Washington, a very respected colleague of mine. The quote was going into a magazine piece. E.J. was at the New York Times Magazine, as I would be later. The piece was being written. He actually took the quote put the quote in his piece, and then an editor took it out. So for a while, it wasn't even in the piece. It ended up being slipped back in. The Miami Herald gets a tip about Hart. They make the decision to follow up on the tip. They make the decision to put him under surveillance. And while that surveillance has commenced, they read the quote. And what they do is they take that quote and they put it in their big expose when it runs, that they've caught Gary Hart with this woman, so that the two things are forever after conflated in the public mind. It's very significant because it means that it actually wasn't Hart who invited this complete redrawing of the boundaries or this re-examination of political lives versus personal lives. It was us. It was us as an industry. It's also true that people think the reason that he was driven out of the race by the photograph, right? You know the famous photo. You can't get away from the photo. Any Google search, the photo, it's even, it's in reviews. The photo will never go away. This is the photo of Hart with Donna Rice on his lap on a boat, except it's not on a boat. It's actually taken on a pier. Significant because it was crowded. There were like hundreds of people milling around. This is not a moment of passion. And it actually didn't surface publicly until the National Enquirer ran it 3 weeks after he was out of the race. It had absolutely nothing to do with the end of Hart's campaign. And the other thing I realized as I went back and looked at it was that this was a story with absolutely remarkable events. Even if you know them, there are remarkable scenes and turns to story and remarkable characters. That there were really people to examine and look at. And I'll talk about a few of those characters rather than go through all the events because I know you want to read the book and I don't want to spoil it for you. I will go through a few of the characters who populate this book because it is at its core a narrative. If you've read about it, we've had a bunch of media now. We've been out for about a month. And all of the discussion is about journalism ethics and media and politics and candidates. And all that's great because that's at the core of the book. But to me, and I think to people who read it, it's really a story. It's really a narrative. It is at its heart and throughout sort of an incredible tale. And it involves these very fascinating characters, the first of whom is Hart himself, who, has kind of been forgotten of what he was in that moment. If you ask most college audiences, they've never heard of Gary Hart. But Hart was, at that moment in 1987, he is the Hillary Clinton of his moment. He's the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party. He's very nearly stolen the race from Walter Mondale in 1984, came from nowhere to win every state west of the Mississippi, most of the last of the primaries and caucuses. Were it not for the superdelegates, he probably would have had that nomination. He's 20 points ahead of the next two Democrats in line, and neither of them are running. One of them's Lee Iacocca, and I don't even think he was a Democrat, honestly. He's double digits ahead of George H.W. Bush, the sitting vice president, and presumed nominee of the Republican Party. He's a visionary. Visionaries are rare in politics. He's a visionary. Hart sees around corners in a way, and this is what makes him such a fascinating character. He sees around corners in a way that very few politicians ever will. He's talking about the rise of stateless extremist Islamist terror in the mid-1980s. He's talking about the linkage between energy independence and war in the 1980s. He's talking about the transformation of the manufacturing economy to a silicon chip-based economy. There's only one corner he can't see around. He has no clue what's happening in the culture in terms of the collision of celebrity and politics. And that's because he comes from a totally different world, and I don't think this was ever really appreciated, right? It's that Hart's from post-Depression Kansas, right? He becomes George McGovern's campaign manager at a very young age, in his early 30s. So he's a glamorous figure in Washington very young. He's very well known. Everybody knows his reputation, right? That he and his wife don't have exactly the smoothest of marriages, but nobody ever writes about it. He serves on the Church Commission, so he knows exactly. He was the youngest member of the Church Commission, probably too young. He's a brand new senator. Knows exactly what John Kennedy was up to, and he knows exactly that none of it was ever reported. He ends up, he separates twice from his wife, during which time he's openly dating women in Washington. At one point, he sleeps on Bob Woodward's couch for a while until Woodward kicks him out, and nobody writes about that, and certainly Woodward's not going to do it. By 1984, during the seminal weeks in 1984, after he emerges to challenge Mondale, he's the most watched, talked about presidential candidate, not just of that moment, but in modern history. I mean, Paul Taylor, who was then the Washington Post reporter, writing later, says, it was not since the Beatles came on Ed Sullivan's show had anyone taken America quite by storm that way. No one touches his sex life. So Hart cannot be convinced that anybody's going to care about this. And to the extent he thinks anybody's going to care about it, he's pretty certain no one's ever going to go looking for it. And the collision that happens, his friend Warren Beatty tells him, there's no more privacy. And he says, well, that's Hollywood. That's not Washington. And the collision of tabloidism and celebrity and politics that happens in that week utterly dumbfound this man who sees so much about everything else. And there's a point at which they're sort of, he comes to New York to give a speech, and the tabloid photographers, just hurling themselves onto the windshield, and they're veering up Park Avenue to get away. and they've got 2 cars trying to block him, and one of them jumps the median divider, one of these news crews, to try and cut them off. It's an amazing thing, and nobody's ever seen anything like this in politics. And Hart says in the back of the car, he says to no one in particular, why do they have to chase me? And then you have the reporters like Tom Fiedler, who's a fascinating character. Fiedler is the lead reporter at the Miami Herald at that time. An extremely respected reporter, goes on to run the Miami Herald, now the dean of the College of Communications at Boston University. It's Fiedler who gets the call from an anonymous tipster, who I then go back and identify, because you can do that kind of thing 27 years later, who basically was diming out her friend because she was jealous and angry that her friend was getting more attention than she was. And Fiedler gets the call and makes this determination that this is clearly about news. Because in Fiedler's mind, and in the mind of a lot of the new, younger reporters, Watergate is still ringing. And the idea that the liar, they have to deny the liar another shot at the White House, and it doesn't matter what the lie's about. Their job is simply to tell the public where somebody is being fraudulent. And you also have this new generation of reporters who are trying to become Woodward and Bernstein. It's the noblest, most vital calling of the profession now, is to take down a politician, to expose the scandal. And so he and his colleagues go, and they put Hart under surveillance. They've got, one guy's wearing a parka in May, and Fiedler's in jogging clothes, and he's kind of jogging one way and jogging the other, because Hart would recognize him if he sees him. And they end up with this remarkable scene. They've got the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party up against the brick wall next to his townhouse here on Capitol Hill. He's wearing a white hoodie. It's late at night. He's led them on this long chase, and they're literally saying to him, well, who is this woman in your house, and have you had sex with her, and how long have you known her? Nothing like this has ever happened in presidential politics. And I think in that moment, in that alley, the ground of politics and political journalism really shifts forever. I think it was going to shift, whether it was Hart or the Miami Herald. Nobody did this by their actions. This was a bunch of forces in the society coming together, and that's where they really collide. And then you have another journalist, Paul Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, was at the Washington Post. Taylor ends up at a news conference in New Hampshire, this kind of sweat-soaked, packed news conference that you don't have you wouldn't notice even being out of the ordinary today, because you're so used to camera crews crowding around candidates. But at this time, it's unusual. You have tabloid press, you have political press. It's 100 degrees in the room. Nobody's done any crowd control. Nobody's established any perimeter. There's actually an aide on all fours, planted himself in front of Hart to keep the press from toppling him over. And Taylor gets Hart's attention during this news conference and says, Hart's really performing well. He's deflecting all the questions. They say to him, Senator, do you think you should take a lie detector test? He says, I think the voters are a pretty good lie detector test, and everyone laughs. And Taylor says to him, in a very quiet voice, very tense exchange, he says, Senator, I'd like to ask you a few questions. And he says, fine. And he says, are you a moral leader? You consider yourself a moral person, you've said. And he says, yes, I do. And he says, do you think adultery is immoral? Hart says, yes, I suppose it is. And he says, Senator, I'd like to know, have you ever committed adultery? No one's ever heard a question like that. And the people who were in that room, and I've met some of them as I've gone around, have kind of shown up at events. The people in that room gasped when they heard it. They all remember it to this day. The aides all remember it to this day. No one had ever heard an open-ended question like that. And they'd actually practiced it on the plane up. Hart's press secretary had said to him, you could get this question. He said, well, that's nobody's goddamn business. I'm not going to answer that. And they said, that's perfect. That's your answer. But in the moment, all that resolve sort of deserts him. And he's looking at this crowd of reporters as I'm looking at you, and he sees the reporters who were on his plane and his bus in 1984 who were sleeping with each other while married. And they're standing there with, angrily expecting an answer. And he's flummoxed by it. And he ultimately kind of pauses for a very long time and says, I don't think that's a fair question. And that was really the end of his campaign. 24 hours, he's back in Colorado. And the only other character I would mention is Donna Rice, because she often gets overlooked, as women in these scandals often do. But Donna Rice was a pretty remarkable woman. In addition to being an aspiring actress and model, she was a Phi Beta Kappa from the University of South Carolina. She was the leading pharmaceutical rep in her district for Wyeth Pharmaceuticals. And no one's ever gone through what Donna Rice goes through before, not on the presidential level, and not in the age of the satellite dish, which is brand new. So Donna Rice, all she wants to do is go home. She wants to tell Hart she didn't have any part in this. She wants to make sure he understands she wants to go home. And they keep saying, well, before you go home, you got to do this. Before you go home, you got to sit down and debrief everybody and tell us the details of your life that are going to come out because we need to know. And before you go home, you got to talk to the press. So she goes to Miami and she meets with the press. And then, they say, well, before you go home, you've got to have people with you and we've got to get you back. And then she finally makes it back to her condominium in Miami and realizes that nothing is going to be the same. There are reporters shooting from boats that they've rented in the pier so they can get the camera lenses, get the camera angle through the windows. There are helicopters overhead. There are neighbors who've rented out their apartments, their condos at very high cost to the media so they can be close to her. She's hungry, so she orders pizza. The pizza delivery guy can't get through the front door because he's mobbed by press about where he's going. And at some point in that day or so, it occurs to Donna Rice that what they've been trying to tell her is she's never going home again. And she appeals for help, and actually a guy who would become a father figure to her, Hart's guy in Florida, who's now dead, Tom McAlilly, he arranges a charter flight for her. And they take her out of her condominium complex they rush her out and get her into a car, and she's pursued up the highway by media vans. And they finally get to the airstrip, they lose the media vans. She gets on this charter plane. She buckles herself in. They start the engine. She has absolutely no idea where she's going. And part of what I do, tried to do in going back with the book is to go back and talk to these people, to Donna Rice, to Tom Fiedler, to Paul Taylor, and of course, a lot of time with Hart. And to see how the moment reverberated in all of their lives and how they reflect on the decisions they made in that moment. But also, importantly, how the moment reverberates through our politics and through our journalism. Because that's where it connects to my story and my experience. Because what really happened in the years after that scandal, and I think was inevitable, is that political journalism takes a turn and the ethos of my industry becomes not about figuring out what your worldview is or how you came to it, but it's about exposing the fraud. You're lying about something. It's our job to figure out what it is and put it before the voters and let them decide if it matters. And the scandal becomes the ultimate conceit. That's why we add the word gate to everything. And it very much skews the reality of our business. As Bob Kerrey, the former senator, he and I are actually doing an event together. He's going to interview me tomorrow night at the Strand, which is going to be great. And Bob Kerrey said to me once, and I talk about it in the book, we're not the worst things we've ever done in our lives, and there's a tendency to think that we are. And that quote really stayed with me because what we did was create a business where you are actually the worst thing you've ever done, or the worst thing you've done that month at any rate. And there's no context for it. And there is no accumulated public record or history. And there's very little compassion. And the problem is that when you do that, when you create that culture, you drive a lot of people out of politics who have something to contribute, like a Gary Hart. You keep a lot of people out of politics, who knows how many, because they're not craven or narcissistic enough to want to subject their families and themselves to that level of invasiveness and scrutiny and suspicion. But more than that, I think it gets overlooked. You allow a lot of people into public office who really have no business being there. Because when you've no longer focused on worldviews and ideas and agendas for the country, and instead focus only on these issues we call character, this all-encompassing thing about the way you've lived your life, who you are as a character, as a celebrity, then you actually make it very possible for people who have no ideas or worldviews to simply glide through the process if they can navigate whatever the scandal might be and find themselves holding office with absolutely no idea what they want to do with it, no idea what the issues are about. And, when Hart got out of the race in 1987, I'll close with this. He gave a speech. His staff wrote a speech for him. It was a very contrite speech. He was going to apologize. And he said it made him want to vomit. And he couldn't sleep, and he talked to Warren Beatty late at night, which was probably not the best idea. And he comes out the next day, and he gives this speech, this kind of Bulworth moment before there was Bulworth. It's a remarkable speech. It was just lost to the ages. But to me, it's kind of like Eisenhower's military-industrial complex speech. It's really remarkable. You can get it on C-SPAN. I've probably sent more people to this speech on C-SPAN than have been to C-SPAN for a while. But it's a really, I think it's an amazing speech. And he gets up and he says, this is the page I was looking for earlier. And I'll just I'll skip around a bit here, but he says, we're all going to have to seriously question the system for selecting our national leaders that reduces the press of this nation to hunters and presidential candidates to being hunted. And then he says, if it continues to destroy people's integrity and honor, then that system will eventually destroy itself. Politics in this country, take it from me, is on the verge of becoming another form of athletic competition or a sporting match. We'd all better do something to make this system work, or we're all going to be soon rephrasing Jefferson to say, I tremble for my country when I think we may, in fact, get the kind of leaders we deserve. And he was immediately and almost universally mocked for that speech. It was panned everywhere because he wasn't taking responsibility for his own actions, and he wasn't admitting what he had done, and he was blaming everybody else for creating the dynamic. But I got to tell you something. I've covered 4 presidential campaigns. I've been covering national politics for 15 years. I've been all around this country more times than I could count. And I do not think there are many people laughing at the idea now that we get the leaders we deserve. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for taking a look at the book, because I'm told you can't put it down, but I'm biased in that way. And I'm happy to answer questions and happy to sign books. Thanks.
Dashed up here. I guess I better have something significant to ask.
Well, I got up and stalled while I looked for a page, so take your time.
Well, I really enjoyed the presentation very much.
Thank you.
And I can easily accept that the Hart campaign and the dissolution of his campaign, that event separated the point in time when the candidate's personal life became an issue from their worldview, and that's an important thing. But it seems like much more important is historically speaking, is the point in time when campaigns formerly were in general about consequential things like worldview and so forth, and when they were much more about sound bites and personal, about character and about, it's the more general interpretation of the significance of this event over just the separation between when it was a fair game for reporters to ask candidates about their sex life or whatever, and the more general case that separates issues from less consequential things like personal things. Can you make a good case that I mean, I can see the logic of the connection between the two, but just from the point of view of the campaigns before and the campaigns after and the issues that were discussed or weren't discussed, is that really a good, is that a sound conclusion that was the point in time when our politics changed so fundamentally? Well,
I mean, yes. I mean, the first thing I would say is that there's no switch to flip in these things. So, none of us can be so facile as to say it was all one way this moment and all one way the next. You can go back and find exceptions to the rule on either side. But I do think it's a pivotal moment, and I spend the better part of the second chapter of the book, which is harder to do here when you're presenting, when you're just talking about what it is and trying to get people to find it fascinating. But there's a second, in the second chapter, I spent a bunch of time on the forces that were changing in the society at that time. It's a pivotal moment, regardless of Hart. I firmly believe that, and I think I made this point, that he doesn't create it, and neither does the Miami Herald. He walks into it. Somebody's going to walk into it. If it's not him, it's going to be Clinton or somebody else, because there's all these things happening. There's what I described in the media with the changes of the new generation coming in who want to be Woodward and Bernstein and who feel very stung by Watergate and Vietnam before it, and very determined to ferret out characters. So characters becoming a much bigger issue generally in the politics. And just as the Cold War dies down, so there's sort of a vacuum that's in the structure of the argumentative structure of campaigns over decades that's going to be filled by this issue, and characters becoming a very current debate in politics. You have, at the same time that's going on, you have the invention of the satellite dish. So this changes really the definition of news, because all of a sudden, beginning in the early 1980s with CNN, although all the networks begin to pick it up very quickly, you can now go anywhere and broadcast live, which you couldn't do before at a moment's notice. And this creates a different kind of news, right? Drama and tabloidism and soap operas kind of stories lend themselves very well to that kind of coverage. So in the couple of months before Hart, literally a few months before, you have the Jim and Tammy Faye Baker thing. You remember this with the preacher and the wife with the mascara and whatnot. That was Ted Koppel's highest rated show ever when he interviewed them on television. You also have, and it's interesting that the week this happens with Hart, the Iran-Contra hearings are beginning in Washington. Everybody's covering Hart. They're not covering the Iran-Contra hearings because the facts of Iran-Contra were in some ways, I think, much more egregious than Watergate. But all anyone remembers and all anyone's focused on at that time is Fawn Hall and Oliver North. I mean, she's the secretary for Oliver, and she stuffs the papers in her boots and her skirt, although now, again, it's like the Hart thing we remember. Most people would say she stuffed him in her underwear. That's just not true. But I'm not doing a book. That's somebody else's book. So there's already this tabloid current in the culture. And then you really have changing attitudes about adultery on the left, because the feminist movement has really changed. The sort of Mad Men era that people are used to is passing, and there's a different attitude. There's a lot less tolerance. You have more women coming into journalism who look at it differently. And you have, on the right, the rise of the moral majority and the sort of religious crusaders for Reagan's cause, who also are focused on morality and character and care a lot about this. So all of these things are colliding in that moment. It's the reason I find that moment so interesting. It's the thing I think, when I say I missed something initially, to me that's what it was. It was all the surround that created that moment, and that had a lot more to do with it, I think, than Hart or any of the other decisions. And that's why I do think in that moment you can see a turning point from a more serious kind of politics to a more trivial kind of politics. The only other thing I would say is I spend a good deal of time in the book talking about Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a really fabulous, unbelievable book. I don't really want to pitch another book while I'm here, but Neil Postman's book is an unbelievably prescient social critique written in 1985, just before this scandal, in which he talks about how the effect that television has had on the culture, and particularly on news and politics, and how entertainment is beginning to bleed into every facet of our public discourse. And I think it was really borne out by the Hart event, which is why I talk about it as much as I do. Hey, Alex.
Hi, Matt. This is great. There's a lot to say, but I have one sort of particular question for you, which is, I guess I'm sort of two minds about this and all the scandals that I've lived through in my life, which is that on the one hand, I want to condemn the media, and I dislike the entertainment factor and the chasing people down and all the consequences. And on the other hand, sometimes there are things about people that I want to know. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about when it does matter, or what is that gray area, and how do you, having done this work, kind of navigate, what kind of dirt is dirt that we should know? What kind of dirt is dirt we shouldn't know? How do we decide? How as a culture do we, how do we make that decision?
It's a big question. I learned as a magazine writer that it was, this is one of the great things about the New York Times Magazine, was that it was okay to be conflicted and actually honest and productive to work that conflict out on the page in some way, so that, to share with readers the complexity of an issue, even if you couldn't really solve it. And so, I wrestle a lot in the book with this question. Without coming to any neat conclusions. I mean, I could sit here and reel off, sometimes it does matter, and I could sit here and reel off examples where I think it really did. Poor John Edwards, I always pick on him when this comes up, but I think John Edwards is a great example. I mean, look, I wrote 8,000 words on John Edwards' anti-poverty platform. I took it very seriously. Mm-hmm. And one of the core tenets of his anti-poverty platform, really one of the only tenets that was even a nod to what we knew about modern poverty and how it affected communities, was a very strong call for responsible fatherhood. That fathers had to take responsibility for their kids. Mm-hmm. It turned out he was lying rather than acknowledge his own kid and making an aide take responsibility, pretend it was his. Like, that's a hypocrisy I have a hard time coming back from. And I think it mattered more than, as I say in the book, I think it mattered more than my work on his anti-poverty platform. And it was the National Enquirer who wrote it. I personally think Bill Clinton's scandal in the second term was probably not impeachable, but probably almost certainly was news. I don't know how you could argue otherwise. I think what we know about John Kennedy now probably should have been reported in the 90s. I mean, he was carrying on an affair with the girlfriend of a mobster. It might have got him killed for all we know. And, an interesting character who sort of runs through this, the subtext of the book is Ben Bradley, of course, who died this week and was I don't think anybody would argue wasn't one of the most important Americans of the 20th century and a brilliant public servant and a brilliant editor. He's there in 1960 with Kennedy and always says he didn't really know, but at the very least didn't want to know. And then there plays this pivotal role in Watergate where he really becomes a national hero. I mean, that movie is such an iconic moment in American culture and journalism. I think people still think he's Jason Robards. And then, really plays a big role in taking down Hart in the end, in the final chapter of the scandal. Not the final chapter of the book, but the final chapter of the scandal. I wrestle with this question of how does Bradley get from 1960 to 1987? I agree with you. It's a complicated question. The place I always come back to, and I come back to in the book, is about judgment and choices, right? That I think we've erected this notion in my industry that we don't have choices, that we're just sort of carried downstream. We cover the story because it's out there. We cover the story because if he'll lie to his wife, he'll lie to the rest of us. We cover the story because, every lie is the same and any dishonesty is the same, right? It's not the sex, it's the lie, right? And Tom Fiedler says to me in the book, it's not my job to decide which character transgression matters. It's my job to vet candidates for voters and let the voters decide. And I say, no, actually, because everything we do in journalism every day is a choice of prioritization. To govern is to choose. That's the Latin root. Well, journalism is to choose too, right? We choose what's on a front page and what's on a back page, what's on the top of the front page, what's below the fold, what's at the top of a story, what's not a story. I don't write every column I want to write every week. I choose one. So actually only in the realm of scandal and salaciousness do we say, no, that's for the voters to decide. We can't get into that process. And I think it's an abdication. I think it's a damaging abdication. And so what I really just come back to is that I think as a business, and I think we can and will, that we have to accept that we have a role to play, that we have judgments to make and choices that are ours. And we don't have to make the same choices somebody else makes. And we use that judgment in other places, and we need to use it here. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't realize we had another. Let's go over here, and we'll go back and forth.
He was up first.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
I'll let you work it out.
You mentioned the 1984 race. I was going to ask you something about that. To me, one of the interesting paradoxes about Hart is that he was quite the visionary, to be sure, but at the same time, part of, I think, the reason he lost in '84 was that he ran this campaign where he kept, as I recall, kept going new ideas, but you could never pin him down to what they were. And after a while, Mondale had this "Where's the beef?" chant that was making fun of that there was a big fast food hamburger commercial that had I think it was Wendy's. With,
do y'all remember the "Where's the beef" ad?
Yeah, and that became Mondale's theme in that second half of that campaign. Where's the beef? Where's the beef? So I've always wondered, how could a guy with such a visionary spend so much time in 1984 not being specific enough to really get his points home, and in maybe blowing the primary at that point.
Well, I'm not. I would take a slightly different interpretation of '84. He hadn't thought through governing as deeply as he would later, but he had some pretty complex ideas. The problem is, he was at 3% in the polls and had no money when he started out. So there was very little apparatus for that campaign. And when Mondale came out then in that. It was a debate in Atlanta, and he says, he's got the line all ginned up, ready to go. It's kind of funny if you watch the video now because he keeps trying to deliver it, and Hart keeps going on, and Mondale's he keeps trying to, where's the, and then finally he's like, well, where's the beef? And it's hilarious. It's just like that woman in the end, and it sticks. It becomes it's one of the great debate moments of all time. I would actually say. And Hart would say, Hart really doesn't think it was that big a deal. I think it was a big deal, but the bigger deal came actually near the end of that campaign. He might well have locked up the delegates he needed without, at least minus the superdelegates, if he hadn't said this really stupid thing when he was in California and his wife was in New Jersey. You remember this? And he said something to the effect of, I'm so lucky I get to be here. This is like the last week of the primary. I get to be here in sunny California. My wife has to drink the water in New Jersey. And Art was a little too funny for his own good. And it really cost him in New Jersey, where they hadn't yet realized their water was quite bad. So he ends up losing New Jersey, winning California, and he probably would have won them both. Now that was probably a bigger moment. But what's part of what I talk about? I do spend some time in the book on. Really, I really pick up from the run up to '87, so post '84, and how I think in that period, probably between the end of 1984 when Mondale loses and May of 1987 when the scandal hits, I think he probably thinks as deeply about governing the country as any presidential candidate of the era, up to and including Bill Clinton, who I think was quite visionary in his own way. But Hart really had thought through how he wanted to campaign differently, how he wanted to govern, what his plans would be, and then of course they put out probably the most detailed agenda of anyone to that time, and a series of 3 foreign policy lectures, a huge plan on public investment, which Clinton would actually lift a lot of this later, both tactically and substantively. So I think in that period he certainly distinguished himself as eminently ready to govern in a forward-looking and a very unconventional way. Yeah.
Well, I think my question sort of follows on from his. I agree. I dislike the tabloidization of campaigns, and I think that it's been a really bad thing. But I think that I heard you saying much the same at more length about Gary Hart on the radio, and I was impressed that you were so impressed, but I have this memory of the fact that I worked in the Senate for a number of years in the 70s and early 80s, and I had a good friend who went to work for Gary Hart, and Hart wanted to bring out a book, and my friend wrote the economics part, and someone else wrote the foreign policy part, and I don't really recall. And this is perfectly normal that the book is drafted by other people, but they could not get Hart to read it even. He wouldn't, not just that he wouldn't comment on it, give them ideas, he would not read it. And they kept saying, but Senator, this is going to come out as your ideas. This may explain why he was a bit sketchy. And then afterwards, when he was interviewed, he said he'd written every word of the book, and he hadn't even read it. So I don't know. That kind of soured me on him.
Well, I wish that were more unusual in politics. It's not. I don't know about that particular venture. I can tell you, and the Lord knows the man had his flaws, so I'm not arguing otherwise. I can tell you he's written almost about 20 books at this point. I assure you, most of them himself. Some good, some not that great. And has went on and got a PhD at Oxford in the years after in political science as well. I mean, I don't think anyone who ever worked closely with Hart or knows him thought lack of substance was the problem. I think his intellect is pretty remarkable. I would say, just from personal experience, his intellect is rivals any politician I've ever known. But there was certainly a feeling there was something sketchy and off. And I do I talk about that in the book, and I think there was. I mean, I think culturally he was, Hart was positioned himself as the sort of harbinger of the 60s generation bursting into leadership. You had Ronald Reagan, who was so much older, Tip O'Neill, who was so much older, right? It was the time was ripe for the boomer entry into politics, and Hart was sort of the guy waiting in the wings. The problem is he was really 10 years. He was actually a little bit of an imposter because he was born in 1936. He's 10 years before the boom starts. And it's a very big discrepancy in American life because particularly when you've grown up in post-Depression Kansas and you've gone to Bible college and divinity school and studied philosophy, he was culturally very, very different from the reporters who covered him and a lot of the Senate aides and the people he knew in Washington. He was very, very formal. They'd all make fun of him because he'd go on TV and he'd say Mr. Koppel and Mr. Rather, whereas everybody was now very informal and saying Ted and Dan. And, there was a whole, and then there were all these theories about why is his one birth certificate in the Senate said he was 49, but then he turns out to be 50, or his signature had changed. Why did he change his signature? And there was definitely a feeling that something about the guy was off. But I think in retrospect, a lot of that sort of comes down to this cultural disconnect at a moment of generational ascendance, where he was kind of a bridge figure between one moment and the next and wasn't fully in sync with the generation he was supposed to be representing. I think that's probably more of an issue than, in terms of his perception and his problems with perception here than his intellectual substance, which I think was pretty solid.
Well, don't forget that Jimmy Carter was criticized for being too good.
Right. Well, yeah. Tom Fiedler wrote a piece in Politico, as some of you may have seen, in which he said, there's no such thing as an inconsequential lie. And his real question was, why hadn't we asked Roosevelt and Johnson and Kennedy about their sex lives? And my answer to that was, well, I guess we could. And we could disqualify them. They would also have to lie or obfuscate, and we could disqualify all of them on moral grounds, but we'd have to figure out how to get through the Great Depression and the Second World War and the Great Society and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we could have 25 terms of the Carter administration. All good. Yes?
So instead of looking backwards at Hart, looking forwards, and even looking at recent elections, you've got Pastor Wright, you've got the 47% closed-door fundraiser, you've got Bruce Bailey raving about, Chuck Grassley's qualifications to run the Senate committee. These are all things that are done behind closed doors that have made press, that have been huge issues in campaigns. So there's no incentive, really, is there, for a journalist to not, to choose, in your words. What breaks the fever? At what point is the gotcha? If this was a seminal turning point, what's the next one? What event or what disaster or calamities?
You put your finger on something really important that you've highlighted, something I should have highlighted, which is this is not just about sex. Often this conversation veers into sex. It's really not. It's about what's commonly referred to as the gotcha, right? But it's about a culture of choosing embarrassment, moments as sort of iconic. I think my answer to your question, first of all, I actually, as I say, I wrote the book as a story, not as a manifesto. So I'm sometimes a little taken aback at the way it's talked about, because there is no last chapter. Here are the 10 things we should do to be better people and better journalists. I'm not a prescriptive writer, so it's often frustrating for people that I don't have the facile answer, because I don't. But it really comes back to me. It really comes back to context, and all these things are going to get reported and should. I don't think we want a media that doesn't report the 47% or the attacks going back and forth in a campaign. Has someone paid their taxes? Has someone did they pay their nanny taxes? Did their mortgage bank forget to pay one day? Did they say something stupid? Joe Biden gets drummed out of the presidential campaign months after Hart because of one time he's been crediting a speech over and over, and then he forgets, and it's like, has he done the worst thing ever? I think my point is that for most of the life of the nation, your character, your moral fitness to serve was actually judged in a fairly complex way. There's an accumulated public Record. As Rick Hertzberg says about Hart in that moment, and what I think is a very prescient piece that almost stands alone in 1987, he says, if the man's a liar, surely there are other examples. Let them be produced. Right? Has a person taken a bribe? Have they ducked votes? Have they lied to their constituents? Have they bended to corporate contributors? All of these things are character. And it's not that the one stupid thing you did shouldn't be pointed out, reported as stupid. It's that for the first time in 1987, I really believe, and ever after, it washes away everything else in the public record. And the only way to get it back, the only way to find any balance, is to do the tell-all or the memoir or the grovel or go on 60 Minutes and drag your wife in front of the cameras or emote or shed a tear or whatever it is. Right? There's a playbook, but the playbook is kind of demeaning, and it necessarily attracts and rewards a certain kind of personality, which is not hard, and not a lot of people who might serve admirably. So, I think I don't think it's too much to ask that we as a business could continue to report all the things we report, and report them with some perspective and context. It is, after all, what people pay us for.
Fair.
I did get the book out of the library, and I thought you did a very sympathetic job with Hart.
Thank
and
you.
his
It's already in
family.
the library?
Absolutely. It's
I knew there was
home
a
right
reason
now.
I hate libraries. Yeah.
I know you have to buy it. I have
Damn
to,
libraries. What are they still doing here?
I have to quote a very sophisticated, beautiful friend of mine who has an explanation for all events like this. She says, Bob, you have to remember that all men are basically 6 years old. And
Where does that put male politicians, though?
she married a doctor from Stanford, so
Yeah.
anyway, you talked very, very briefly about an episode that my dad always thought was one of the underappreciated historical events in American history. Happy Rockefeller giving birth
Yes.
to Nelson Jr. only 5 days
Yeah.
before the California Republican primary. Do you have any thoughts about that beyond what you said in the book?
Well, I wrote an 80,000 word, but I don't think I have any other thoughts about anything. But the Rockefeller thing is really interesting, and there's a reason I talk about it in the book, right? Which is, because Rockefeller, when you start to talk about this, people will say, well, there were always stories about sex. This isn't different. The first thing they do is go back to the 1800s. Well, there's a Hamilton and Cleveland and Ma, where's my pa? And so nothing's really changed. Well, that's a cop-out, because that wasn't the media as we knew it today. It was a bunch of Oppo research firms. Congressmen were still getting caned on the floor of the House. I don't think that's really the right standard that we want to apply to the 21st century. Let's at least start with the 20th century. And then you get to the 20th century, and it is true. I mean, look, sex and character were always a part of politics, and Rockefeller is this great example. And I can't wait to read this new biography on him too. I haven't read it yet, because his affair and then remarriage, his divorce and his remarriage, become a part of Republican politics. It has an effect on his standing with voters, and as a result, it has to be covered. Chappaquiddick is the other example I mentioned, right? It has to be covered, right? Who's not going to call that news? But here's the thing, nobody goes looking for it, right? In other words, nobody's camped under Nelson Rockefeller's window. Nobody's going through his trash. It's it's an issue. It's got to be dealt with. And then when it is reported and it's embarrassing, and the same is true, Chappaquiddick's almost a better example, it doesn't do what I was just talking about. It actually doesn't define the person. Nelson Rockefeller goes on to be vice president. Right. At a moment when the nation needs, when the judgment is that the nation needs a skilled, rock solid, trustworthy leader, they go to Nelson Rockefeller, who's now 10 years removed from that scandal. Ted Kennedy is lionized by the time he dies as a giant of the Senate, and when he runs for president, it's actually not Chappaquiddick that does him in, although it comes up as it should. So. There is with Rockefeller and with Kennedy and with, I would argue even with Tom Eagleton, who I mentioned in the book, and his, there is a context that prevails, and a sort of reason for the crossing of the boundaries, and there's, it offers a really pointed and interesting contrast to what came after and what we live with today. Yes.
You're going to find out where the title came from, which is interesting. There's an actually interesting story about who he credits writing parts of his novel.
Yes. Yeah. Well, they co-wrote. Yeah.
That's my point.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I won't give that part. And then I think the other thing that is so fascinating is really the conundrum for not only individual journalists in their own careers, but then the sort of response of the larger collective journalistic world to all of this as it's unfolded and since. And so it's a tremendous book. And
thank you. Thanks so much.
Please do read it. I'm sure if you have friends who are political junkies, they'll be fascinated by it. Well, and please offer the last question.
Thank you. I'm curious if you differentiate, or whether you think all of us should differentiate between news media, your responsibility in terms of your industry, but also, let's say if Donna Rice had outed him, and I was thinking of Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, if the person, I don't know if you want to call it victim or the woman in this situation, although it could be a man as well. But so is there a differentiation between what Anita Hill brought forth, and this was about a man who's not going to be an elected position, but something for life, a position for life. And would you have differentiated if Donna Rice stood up and said, this guy's a hypocrite and, whatever?
Which, by the way, she never does. I mean, it's been 27 years, and, I talked to her a bunch for the book, and she's always either, I don't know if you could say protected him because that has a certain connotation, but she has always taken the high road and has never chosen to blame him or embarrass him in any way, which is kind of remarkable. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought for a second as I was thinking about that. I think one of the things that happens, I don't, I differentiate. I hesitate to differentiate because while that can sometimes, sure, sometimes if somebody feels they've been wronged and comes out with it, it can be a more compelling case. But at the same time, it also opens the door for anybody to accuse anybody of anything. And, one of the things that happens in the years after this scandal is that it occurs to very sharp minds in politics. And this is really also the beginning of the consultant culture and the campaign as an industry. And, what occurs to some of the smarter, more devious people in politics is that, well, this is a really dangerous moment because any so-called character issue can destroy you, but it can also destroy your opponent. And if you can turn that torpedo in the right direction, you can achieve things you could never achieve at the ballot box. Right? Newt Gingrich knows he's not going to beat Jim Wright at the ballot box. It's going to be almost impossible. But over a trumped-up scandal about book receipts, personally, I don't think anyone should ever be punished for making money off a book. But this trumped up thing over whether he took too much than was legally allowed over the book, and ends up being this scandal, and the first speaker in history who has to resign from office. And then of course we have another speaker designate who has to resign just after Gingrich. So, you now start this parade of people who can be publicly accused and accusers who can be manipulated. And so I think it really comes back to the same point I had made earlier about context, that I think, look, we can't not pay attention to that, right? I mean, if there's a significant allegation, it's going to be investigated. If there's a significant story, reporters find it's going to be investigated. But it's a question of withholding judgment and also just putting it in the perspective of someone's life and career. I don't think, anybody in this room wants to be judged, remembered, or have the balance of their professional lives based on the thing they least wish they had done. And I don't think anybody in my industry does. And so I think, there's a way to report these stories that's just more responsible. And it's, as I say, it's not just about sex. It's about integrity. And understanding that integrity is complex and that truthful people tell lies and moral people do immoral things. And here's the only other thing I would say about this is that here's what we really want in our politics, right? What we really want, and there's a lot of this lately, I wrote a column about what we really want is the Johnsonian or even Clintonian character who can twist arms and forge consensus and bend the machinery to his will and, by sheer force of personal dynamism, make the system work that we feel is no longer operating efficiently. We just want that person to shut all that off when they turn out the light at night and go back to their personal life. And that's never going to happen because actually people are the same. People who have that kind of personal dynamism are the same in their private lives most often. And so you just have to judge, hopefully, the totality of people with some complexity and some intellectual honesty. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.